What if the most powerful country on Earth could vanish without a single foreign soldier setting foot on its land? For decades, the Soviet Union was one of the two global superpowers, rivaling the United States in every arena: military, technology, and ideology. But in December 1991, it was gone. No bombs fell on Moscow. No grand final battle took place. Instead, it crumbled from the inside, collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. This is not just a story of political leaders or economic charts. It's the story of millions of ordinary people caught between an empire's promise and its sudden end. We will walk through the events in clear, straightforward language, without complicated jargon, so anyone can understand why this giant fell. And by the end, you might see that the Soviet collapse wasn't inevitable. It was a chain of human choices and historical forces colliding. From the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev to the failed coup of 1991, from bread shortages to the independence movements of its republics, this is the Soviet Union's fall told simply, but completely. Let's begin. The Soviet Union in the early 1980s was still feared and respected around the world. Its military strength was unmatched, and its ideology, communism, had shaped global politics for decades. But behind the parades and the propaganda, cracks were forming. The economy was slowing, innovation was stalling, and everyday life for ordinary citizens was far from the ideal shown on posters. Shops were often empty of basic goods, and waiting in long lines became a normal part of life. The centralized economy, which had worked during times of war and industrialization, struggled in a modern, consumer-driven world. While the West embraced new technologies and markets, the Soviet system clung to outdated structures. The gap between the promise of communism and the reality of life was widening. Internationally, the Cold War was draining Soviet resources. The arms race with the United States demanded enormous spending, leaving little for domestic improvements. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was still a superpower, but one running on momentum and running out of time. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he was younger and more energetic than his predecessors. Unlike the aging leaders before him, he recognized that the Soviet Union could not survive without change. His two main policies, Perestroika, economic restructuring, and Glasnost, openness, were aimed at reviving the country. Perestroika sought to introduce limited market reforms into the rigid planned economy, hoping to increase efficiency and production. Glasnost allowed for more freedom of speech and transparency in government, something unheard of in Soviet politics. At first, these policies were met with optimism both at home and abroad. The West saw Gorbachev as a reformer who could end the Cold War peacefully. However, these changes also unleashed forces Gorbachev couldn't fully control. Openness meant people could now criticize the government publicly. Restructuring meant disrupting an already fragile economy. The very policies meant to save the Soviet Union were beginning to shake its foundations. The Soviet economy in the late 1980s faced problems that reforms alone couldn't solve. Factories were outdated, workers were demotivated, and agriculture lagged behind demand. Despite perestroika, productivity barely improved and shortages worsened. Basic goods like sugar, meat, and soap became harder to find. Citizens spent hours in lines, sometimes returning home empty-handed. The black market flourished as people sought what the state could not provide. These shortages weren't just inconvenient, they eroded faith in the system. Meanwhile, the government's finances were strained. Oil, one of the USSR's main exports, saw falling prices in the global market. This meant less revenue for the state, making it harder to maintain subsidies and imports. The economic decline wasn't just a statistic, it was felt in every kitchen, every apartment, every family. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer a unified ideological machine, but a patchwork of republics with their own cultures, histories, and identities. As economic hardship deepened, these suppressed national identities began to resurface, sparking movements in the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. What was once whispered in private kitchens now filled the streets in the form of massive demonstrations. Nationalism spread like wildfire because people felt the Soviet identity had failed to deliver prosperity or equality. Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians openly demanded restoration of their pre-Soviet independence. In Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, ethnic tensions and separatist aspirations boiled over, creating conflicts the central government could no longer control. For decades, the Soviet Union had tried to erase these divisions under a banner of socialist unity, but the cracks were now visible to the world. Even within Russia itself, voices began to question the Union's purpose. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest of the 15 republics, began asserting its own authority, sometimes in open defiance of the Central Soviet government. Nationalism was no longer just about language or culture. It became a powerful political weapon. The more the Kremlin tried to suppress these movements, the more determined they became, signaling that the Soviet state was no longer capable of holding its diverse empire together. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 had been sold to the public as a short, strategic mission. In reality, it became a decade-long quagmire that drained the Soviet economy and eroded the faith of its people. Soviet soldiers fought a brutal guerrilla war against Afghan Mujahideen fighters, who were supported with arms and training from the United States, Pakistan, and other countries. The mountains of Afghanistan became a graveyard, not only for soldiers, but for Soviet prestige. The war consumed enormous financial and military resources at a time when the Soviet economy was already faltering. Thousands of young men returned home in coffins, while many others came back physically or psychologically scarred. For the first time, Soviet citizens began to openly question their government's military decisions. The official propaganda that painted the war as a noble mission could not hide the mounting death toll and lack of progress. Internationally, the conflict deepened the Cold War divide and further isolated the USSR on the world stage. The Soviet Union's allies grew wary, while its adversaries exploited the war as proof of Soviet overreach. Domestically, the war's failures fed into the growing cynicism about the government's ability to lead. The Afghan War became the USSR's own Vietnam, a conflict that shattered the myth of Soviet military invincibility and exposed the weakness of its political leadership. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was a shadow of the powerhouse it claimed to be. Central planning had created inefficiency on a massive scale. Factories produced goods nobody wanted, while basic necessities like food, clothing, and consumer electronics were in short supply. Long lines outside stores became a daily reality, and corruption thrived in the black market. What was once hailed as a worker's paradise now looked like a system choking under its own bureaucracy. Gorbachev's reforms, Perestroika, were intended to modernize the economy by introducing limited market mechanisms. However, instead of quick recovery, these changes caused chaos. State enterprises no longer had guaranteed quotas, but still lacked the flexibility and incentive to compete effectively. Prices rose, shortages worsened, and many ordinary citizens found themselves poorer than before. The optimism that accompanied reform quickly gave way to frustration and anger. Foreign trade suffered as well, especially with falling oil prices in the global market, which cut into one of the Soviet Union's most critical sources of revenue. With fewer resources, the government could no longer sustain its vast military spending or maintain subsidies to its satellite states in Eastern Europe. Economic stagnation was no longer just a problem for the working class. It became a direct threat to the survival of the Soviet system itself. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he was seen as a young, dynamic leader who could rescue the Soviet Union from decline. His twin policies of Perestroika, restructuring, and Glasnost, openness, were meant to breathe life into the stagnant economy and create a more transparent society. For a brief moment, hope returned to the streets of Moscow and beyond. But the reality was far more complicated. Glasnost encouraged open discussion, but once people started speaking freely, decades of frustration poured out. Citizens didn't just criticize inefficiency, they questioned the very legitimacy of Soviet rule. Meanwhile, Perestroika disrupted the economic system without replacing it with a functional alternative. The result was instability on both political and economic fronts. The Kremlin suddenly faced a level of public scrutiny it was completely unprepared for. Instead of stabilizing the Union, Gorbachev's reforms accelerated its unraveling. Regional leaders saw the weakening of central power as an opportunity to push for more autonomy. Political opponents used the newfound openness to build movements that directly challenged the Communist Party. By attempting to reform the Soviet system from within, Gorbachev had unintentionally loosened the very bolts holding it together. The Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe had been one of its greatest symbols of global power since the end of World War II. But by 1989, the grip was loosening fast. One by one, Soviet-aligned communist regimes in countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia began to fall. Mass protests, free elections, and border openings swept through the region in what became known as the revolutions of 1989. For decades, the Kremlin had maintained its dominance through the threat of military intervention, as seen in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. But this time, Gorbachev chose not to send in tanks. His Sinatra doctrine allowed Eastern Bloc countries to do it their way, signaling that Moscow would no longer use force to maintain its empire. This hands-off approach won him praise abroad, but was seen at home as a sign of weakness. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 became the most iconic symbol of Soviet retreat. The Eastern Bloc's collapse was not just a geopolitical loss, it was a psychological blow to the Soviet Union's image as a superpower. Without its Eastern European buffer, the USSR stood more exposed, both politically and militarily, and the dominoes of disintegration began to fall even faster. Mikhail Gorbachev's Perestroika, meaning restructuring, was introduced in the mid-1980s as a bold attempt to revive the Soviet economy. It aimed to decentralize decision-making and allow limited private enterprise while retaining socialism's core framework. Many Soviet citizens hoped this would bring prosperity, but the reforms quickly exposed the system's deep inefficiencies. Factories, long accustomed to state orders, struggled to adapt to a competitive environment. Instead of revitalizing the economy, shortages and inflation worsened. While Gorbachev envisioned a gradual transformation, the sudden loosening of controls unleashed chaos. Regional leaders began demanding greater autonomy, while some republics openly defied Moscow's authority. Black markets flourished as the state lost its grip on supply chains, and foreign investors hesitated to commit to a still unstable system. Perestroika was meant to save socialism, but it inadvertently weakened the very foundation it sought to protect. Critics accused Gorbachev of dismantling the state without a clear replacement. For the Soviet people, the promise of reform quickly turned into frustration. Food lines grew longer, and salaries lost their value due to rampant inflation. The once proud Soviet military-industrial complex struggled to produce even basic consumer goods. Perestroika was a gamble, and by the late 1980s it was clear the gamble had failed. It had sparked hopes, but those hopes were now fueling anger and unrest across the USSR. Glasnost, or openness, was Gorbachev's companion policy to Perestroika, aimed at increasing transparency in government and encouraging public debate. For decades, the Soviet people had lived under strict censorship, where criticizing the state could mean imprisonment. Now, suddenly, newspapers could publish investigative reports and citizens could openly discuss politics. At first, this created a sense of empowerment and optimism. People believed they could finally shape their future. However, With openness came uncomfortable truths. The media began exposing the horrors of Stalin's purges, the scale of corruption in the Communist Party, and disasters like Chernobyl that had been hidden from the public. Citizens learned that their economic struggles were not just the result of bad luck, but decades of mismanagement. Anger toward the state intensified, and protests became more frequent. Glasnost had broken the fear barrier that kept the Soviet Union together. Ironically, the very freedom intended to strengthen the Soviet system was accelerating its disintegration. As people gained the right to speak, they also gained the courage to demand independence from Moscow. In republics like Lithuania, Estonia, and Georgia, nationalist movements grew louder, and calls for sovereignty became impossible to ignore. Glasnost had opened the floodgates, and there was no turning back. By the late 1980s, nationalist movements had taken root across the Soviet republics. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, mass demonstrations called for independence, waving flags that had been banned for decades. Ukraine began to reclaim its cultural heritage, reviving its language and traditions suppressed under Soviet rule. The Caucasus region saw violent clashes between ethnic groups as old rivalries resurfaced after years of being frozen under Soviet control. Moscow's ability to suppress these movements was fading. The Soviet military, once feared, was hesitant to use force after bloody crackdowns in places like Tbilisi only fueled more resistance. Gorbachev's policies had unintentionally empowered nationalist leaders who used Glasnost to organize and broadcast their demands. For many republics, independence was no longer a distant dream. It was a political goal within reach. Each step toward autonomy weakened the central government. The collapse of Soviet unity was now inevitable. Once the republics realized Moscow could no longer dictate their futures, the race toward sovereignty accelerated. Political leaders began negotiating directly with foreign governments, bypassing Moscow entirely. Nationalism, once considered a threat to socialism, had become the rallying cry for freedom. The Soviet map, long thought unchangeable, was about to be redrawn. The late Soviet economy was a study in collapse. State-run industries were collapsing under the weight of inefficiency, and agricultural production couldn't keep up with demand. Basic goods like bread, sugar, and meat became scarce, forcing citizens to wait in lines that stretched for hours. Foreign trade offered little relief. The Soviet Union relied heavily on oil exports for hard currency, but global oil prices plummeted in the 1980s. Without sufficient foreign reserves, the USSR struggled to import grain and modern technology. Meanwhile, corruption siphoned away what little resources remained. The economic collapse didn't just affect living standards, it undermined the very legitimacy of the Communist Party. Leaders who had promised abundance now presided over hunger and hardship. As factories closed and unemployment rose, loyalty to the Soviet state crumbled. For many, independence from Moscow wasn't just a matter of national pride, it was a survival strategy. In August 1991, a group of hardline communist officials attempted to reverse Gorbachev's reforms through a coup. They placed him under house arrest in Crimea and announced a state of emergency, claiming they were saving the USSR from collapse. Tanks rolled into Moscow, and soldiers occupied key government buildings. But the coup plotters underestimated the public's appetite for change. Thousands of citizens, led by Russian President Boris Yeltsin, gathered around the Russian White House to resist. Yeltsin famously climbed atop a tank, rallying the crowd and urging the military to defy the coup leaders. The coup's defeat shifted the balance of power permanently. Gorbachev returned to Moscow politically weakened, while Yeltsin emerged as the champion of democratic reform. The Soviet Union, already crumbling, now had no chance of recovery. By late 1991, the Soviet Union was little more than a political shell. Republic after republic declared independence, ignoring Moscow's protests. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Bellavia Accords, officially dissolving the USSR and replacing it with the Commonwealth of Independent States. The once mighty Soviet flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin on December 25, 1991. For many, the moment was bittersweet. Some celebrated the birth of independent nations and the end of decades of repression. Others mourned the loss of a superpower that had once challenged the United States on the global stage. Millions were suddenly citizens of new countries, navigating untested governments and uncertain futures. The collapse was a geopolitical earthquake. It reshaped alliances, economies, and borders across Eurasia. The Soviet Union, which had seemed unshakable for over 70 years, had fallen in a matter of months. The post-Soviet years were a time of chaos and adaptation. Former Soviet republics faced the daunting task of building new governments, economies, and national identities. Some embraced democracy and market reforms, while others slid back into authoritarianism. Ordinary people bore the brunt of the transition. Savings vanished overnight, jobs disappeared, and crime surged. While a new generation looked to the West for inspiration, older citizens often longed for the stability of the Soviet era, even with its restrictions. Yet the legacy of the USSR remains deeply woven into the politics and culture of its former republics. Some leaders continue to invoke Soviet nostalgia, while others distance themselves from it entirely. And so, the fall of the Soviet Union was not a single moment in history, but the result of decades of political strain, economic stagnation, and deep cultural shifts that could no longer be contained. It was a story of leaders trying to reform a system too rigid to bend, of ordinary people who dared to imagine a different future, and of a superpower that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. As we look back, we are reminded that even the mightiest empires are built on fragile foundations. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is never as far away as it seems.